Hello, hello, hello. Yay! Yay! I don't know if there are any more stragglers inside, but what a pleasure to welcome you all to the Mary Heaton Vorse House. We began this with not a big plan, but I have to say it has morphed into just an extraordinary living, breathing place that is delightfully brought to life and inhabited by all of you, and it brings us such joy to just sort of glimpse at it. Dreams that I'm blocking the view of these beautiful people. That this pairing would have occurred, but it certainly brings me. I don't know. I'm a bit of a fanboy for Doris in particular, but so forgive me if I blush. But two extraordinary people on our little stage here tonight. One, my friend of many years, more than a decade, maybe a dozen years, Kevin Sessums, who I think it's your third residency here in the house. Kevin is a lovely man and a very talented and gifted writer. He has two wonderful books, including Mississippi Sissy, which as a Southerner and a sissy, it meant a lot to me. And he also was a writer of great note at Vanity Fair and many other publications. And we're very fortunate to have him in the house again as a resident here at the Mary Heaton Vorse House. And that brings us to my new friend, the incomparable Doris Kearns Goodwin. I have been a lover of history my entire life, a lover of historic structures, but also a person who appreciates history and understands its impact and influence and importance in our daily lives. And I don't think there has existed someone that has not only documented it, but brought it home and makes it so deeply relevant. If you don't know, I'm assuming all of you know, but Doris is a Pulitzer Prize winning author of countless books. I think nearly all of them that I've read. And so we are so delighted and deeply, deeply privileged to have you with us this evening, coming and gracing our historic little town and this historic house with your presence. So thank you, Jeff, and to East End Books for making this possible.
Thanks.
I think most of you have gotten your book signed based on the huge line that Doris managed to get through prior to this. I think there could be a few left, so we'll figure that at the end. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kevin and Doris. So thank you.
Thanks. I love your shoes.
Thank you. When you're older like me, you can wear sneakers everywhere.
When I saw them, I was a little less intimidated. Welcome to Provincetown.
We've been staying in Falmouth, but in the early days, I spent a whole summer here at the Figurehead House. Some of you may know it. There were two older women, and I was on the third floor. This was like 45 years ago.
Wow.
And then we were great friends with Norman Mailer, so we spent so much time at his brick house. I feel so nostalgic. It's so great to be back here. And now my older son, I have three sons. The middle son has loved being here so much he's decided he's coming to spend next summer here. So,
I love it.
So we'll be back.
Norman was at your wedding, as was Anna Wintour. That shocked me.
Anna Wintour had a boyfriend then named John Bradshaw, who had written an article about my husband Dick, and he became our friend. So he brought her. I remember how beautiful she was. And Norman was there with his fifth wife, even though he'd already fallen in love with Norris, who would be his best and sixth wife. So anyway, it was a wild. Hunter Thompson was. Our wedding was wild.
And you walked down the aisle to the Impossible Dream.
That was Bobby Kennedy was Dick's best friend in public life. and that was the song that he kept making him listen to when he was hesitating about running for the presidency in 1968.
Oh, wow.
And Bobby said, if you keep playing that damn song, I'm going to do it. And he finally did, but I wish he'd done it earlier.
I love that. I don't remember that from the book, but
No, I don't know that it's in there, but to dream the impossible dream.
Antonia. We're at the Mary Heaton Vorse house, which has lots of history. So I became a little bit of a historian and read about her before I knew I was going to talk to you. And she was an activist and a writer, and was a member of the Heterodox Society and a suffragist. But there's a quote from her that I'd like to say. I cannot imagine anything that would affect better the moral health of any country than something which would blast the greatest number of that indecent, immoral institution, the perfect lady, out of doors and set them smashing and rioting. There is a bit of the perfect lady about you, but you have notes of the broad and the dame. So is it possible to be a historian and a perfect lady?
Well, it has to be if I have parts of it together. I would hope so. But, there's something about when you mention her being a suffragette, I knew so little, which is crazy about the education system, about that whole movement. And I was an historian, and when the 100th anniversary came, they were great, those suffragettes. They risked jail, they had hunger strikes, much more than we knew. The men were awful to them. They would have marches, and they would be brutalized by the men. And they were wearing those huge hoop skirts. They couldn't get them anywhere, so that the fashion really mattered when they could go on a bicycle in a short skirt. No, it's a wonderful thing to be a woman in this day and age. I wish I were young to be able to know what young women know that we all went through, that they don't even know, but they have a freedom of life ahead of them. And women are everywhere. More college, more medical school.
They're running for president.
Maybe even
Let's get the orange elephant out of the yard, okay, and talk a bit about the present testing time as you refer to these times that the country goes through. So, what is your take on the last month?
I mean, for all of us who lived through it, it's just incomprehensible that everything changed in such a short period of time. I mean, starting with the debate, where it looked like, for sure, President Biden would be the nominee. And as much as he's a good guy, I know him pretty well, and I care a lot about him, I think the Democrats would have lost, without a question. Aging was a problem. And then the debate goes terribly, and then it seems like a long time before he's able to decide what to do. And then the next thing you know is the assassination attempt on former President Trump, and then a Republican National Convention, and then it looks like they're moving right toward the election. And then he decides that to withdraw, which I think was a very honorable thing to do. What Lyndon Johnson did in 1968 in March, and then all of a sudden there's hope, and I think Kamala Harris has done better than anybody could have imagined, even those who knew her. The rallies when people respond, say it to my face, say it to my face, or we're not going back. I mean, that kind of, we haven't seen that since Obama, that connection between a crowd and people. So it feels really different now than it did a month ago. And the only thing that I can figure out that has any parallel is that's really what happened in 68. There was a couple of months there where everything changed. Lyndon Johnson decided on March 31st that he would get out of the race, which was a stunning notion to the country at large. And he wanted to hopefully bring the war in Vietnam to a peaceful end. He knew that he would never be able to have any authenticity if he were the candidate still. He also was losing in the primaries badly, and he was so afraid that Bobby Kennedy might come and beat him. They hated each other so. So it had that kind of part. But it was the right thing for him to do. And he was relieved when he did it. I kept saying on television, hoping that it would be listened to, that you'll be relieved if you do this. It'll be good. You'll feel, the editorials will say you were putting principle above politics, you're sacrificing. And they all did say that when Biden got out. But then what happens is he goes among the streets, LBJ does, for the first time people are holding up signs, thank you, Mr. President, instead of the chants about the war. And then on April 3rd, just a few days later, North Vietnam sends a message that they're going to go to the peace table. He said it was the happiest day of his presidency. On April 4th, he was filling a plane of diplomats and generals to go to Hawaii to start the process going. He was going to join it later that night. And then at 5:30, they get the message that Martin Luther King has been killed. And then there's riots in the streets. And then 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy is dead. That period is the only thing that I can think of that had all of that drama that we've experienced to even greater degree in some ways. So we go through this as a nation, but we somehow get through it.
Well, you've written about the Great Depression and the Civil War, and we do go through these times. Your husband said that we are not a fragile people. Do you believe that? Do you believe that we have the sinew to get through this specific time?
I do believe so. With everything, every part of me, I do believe that. It's one of the great things about being an historian, that history really does give you solace, it gives you perspective, and it gives you lessons. I mean, I've lived through, in my mind, those other terrible times in our history. I mean, when Lincoln came into the presidency, the 7 states had seceded from the Union. Democracy was at issue, he said then. If you could decide to secede from the Union because you didn't like the election results, then democracy would be an absurdity. So we saw that in January 6th. And yet, it was a terrible war, but eventually we emerged stronger with emancipation secured and the Union restored. And then you get to the turn of the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt is in a really hard time when he comes in. McKinley has been assassinated, but more importantly, the Industrial Revolution has changed the whole economy so that there's a gap for the first time between the rich and the poor. People have gone off the farms and they're working in terrible conditions. There's tenement houses, and there's a sense that all these new inventions are changing the way of life, so the nostalgia for an earlier way of life. Immigrants are coming in from abroad. There's a nativist sentiment. There are anarchist bombings in the streets. There are nationwide strikes, and the country looked like it was falling apart. Teddy Roosevelt predicted if people in different sections and regions and parties begin viewing each other as the other rather than as common American citizens, democracy will be lost. Again, where we are today. The Depression, of course, when FDR came in, was at its rock bottom. The early days of World War II, it looked like Hitler was going through Western Europe without anybody able to stop him. And yet, in each one of those cases, the Allies won the war, the Depression came to an end with the mobilization, but the people living then, like us, they didn't know how it was going to end. That's what's so amazing about history. We know the answers, and you have to go back to know that they lived like we did with the anxiety, and yet it managed to come through. So history gives us hope that we'll get through this.
Yeah, when you write, you have to develop a sense of suspense that you really don't have, because we know how it turns out, but you, as a writer writing the narrative, you have to embed the suspense.
You're absolutely right. I remember reading a book by Barbara Tuchman, who became a mentor to me just in my imagination. I finally did meet her, but she wrote that even if you're writing about a war, you have to imagine to yourself you don't know how that war ended, just exactly like you say, so that you can carry a reader with you every step along the way, from beginning to middle to end. And that's so true. And that's the fun about history. You just pretend that, okay, he's not going to die, really. In fact, every time I write one of these books, I just don't ever want them to die, and I have to pretend that I don't know that they're going to die. Lincoln's going to live on, somehow. When I'm talking to him, he can't go away. I'm talking to him.
And Richard.
And Dick, most of all.
Right.
No, I mean, you've touched on something so important, really, about the book. There was something about opening these 300 boxes that he had saved crazily and schlepped through our entire lives. They were filled with a time capsule of the 60s, because he'd worked for Kennedy, and he'd worked with Jackie, he'd worked with LBJ, was with McCarthy in New Hampshire, and then was with Bobby when he died. And it had ended so sadly. He knew the ending, so that's why he didn't want to open the boxes all those years. And I knew there was great stuff in them, and as a historian, I couldn't bear it that he wouldn't open them, until finally he decides, when he's 80, he comes down the steps singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning," and he says, all right, it's now or never. If I have any, this is the way he would talk, if I have any wisdom to dispense, I better start dispensing now. So we made this deal that on weekends we would go through the boxes, but exactly like we've been talking about. It's just so amazing. You're right in the rhythm of it all. We were going to do it from beginning to end and suspend our knowledge of what happened later. So we started out going through the boxes, reliving not only his 60s, but mine, even though I was 12 years younger. And it turned out that it really was almost like a talisman, that as long as we had more boxes to open, that even when he got the last cancer that took his life, he couldn't die because we hadn't finished going through the boxes. He one time said, "Who's going to finish first, me or the boxes?" But it gave him a sense of purpose in those last years of his life. He was waking up every morning so excited to know. We didn't even know it was going to be a book at the beginning. We just didn't know what it would be. But he had something to do that mattered. And he began to feel good about what he had done during that period of time rather than sad about it.
When you first started to write it, you were subsuming your voice into his voice. You were trying to get his voice in the book. And then when he died, you couldn't do that anymore. You had to use your voice. So that switch was part of your grief. Would you speak to?
Yeah, it was really, really unsure that I could do it because I was just going to be helping him write the book. It was going to be in his voice, as you say, his words. And we hadn't really gotten all that much done. We'd gotten a whole bunch of stuff gone through, and we talked about it. We had all our conversations. But when he died, I just wasn't sure I could do it anymore, whether it would make me too sad to have to live with the memory that he had just died. And it took me a year. I moved from the big house in Concord that we loved. We had created, speaking of books, we'd created a house of books. I mean, we had 10,000 books in that house. And we had a 3-car garage that we turned into a library. That one entire wall was Lincoln. And then there was a tower that he built somehow because he loved Galileo. And there was a tower that was there. The living room was fiction.
He wrote a whole play about that.
Yeah, he wrote a whole play about Galileo. The living room was fiction. There were drama in a certain place. There was poetry in the dining room. Everything, it was a whole house of books. And I couldn't leave it, I thought, but I couldn't stay in it. It was too hard. And so when I finally decided that I'd move into Boston, I could only take a couple thousand of the books. And I didn't know what to do. And luckily the Concord Public Library, we loved the town of Concord that we lived in, came to me and said they would take the books and they'd create a room called the Goodwin Room. And it's meant so much. It's just, they have Alcott, they have Thoreau. I mean, I didn't realize what it meant. That we're permanently there. And all these books that have our markings in them and all, they kept the same, they were all the nonfiction they took. They kept the same structure that we had in the old house. So, yeah.
But you now live in Boston, and you have views of, you have amazing views from your windows that I've read, and you can see Fenway Park, I think.
You can see the Citgo sign and the river and the State House.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm fascinated with about you is that you're such a baseball fan, and that you're such an imperfect lady that you were the first woman to get into the locker room of the Boston Red Sox in 1979 as a reporter. I think that's worth applause. But I began to understand baseball when I lived in San Francisco and went to see the Giants play. And there's a pastoral aspect, the sort of the geography gist of it, to sit in the greenery and watch it teaches you patience in a way. But would you speak to the other kind of pastoral aspect of baseball and how it ministers to you? I would love to hear you as a writer and a historian and a baseball fan that's so eloquent talking about what baseball. I know part of it is the love of your father.
I think that's so true for many people, that a sport that's shared with a parent then becomes your sport, and you give it to your kids, and it keeps the generations going in some hobby or some sport that's together. I mean, as some of you may know who read Wait Till Next Year, that my father taught me that great mysterious art of keeping score when I was only 6 years old, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And he would come home at night, and for hours he would listen to me with all my miniaturized symbols as I would recount every play of every inning of the game that went through that afternoon. He never told me that he obviously knew how it had already ended. He never told me that this was all in the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. In fact, I think I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions, because at first I'd be so excited he'd come home and I'd say, the Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost. which took the drama of this to where everything's coming back to the same thing. You have to tell it chronologically. So I finally learned. You just said, okay, in the first inning they did this, and then finally they won 5-4 at the end. But my father died when I was in my 20s. My mother died when I was only 15. So somehow, whatever those memories are that keep them alive. I mean, I never would have thought of writing a memoir. I mean, you've written 2 of them, and it's an extraordinary art form. It really matters a lot, and I hadn't realized that. It was only because my book on Franklin and Eleanor came out the same year that Ken Burns' documentary on the history of baseball came out, and I was in it only because I thought I'd be in it for 5 minutes, but he made the Dodgers and the Red Sox these 2 lovable loser teams who almost always won and then would almost always lose until they finally won. And so I was in it a lot. So everywhere I went to talk about Franklin and Eleanor, people would tell me stories about their parents or a father or a mother that loved baseball. So then somebody said, would you write a memoir about it? And so it meant that finally I brought them to life. So that was one memoir, and now bringing Dick still to life. It's really meant a lot. It's very hard to do, though, as you know.
Part of the writing of the book with him is it's a great love story. It's between two people who had sort of parallel lives and then the same life, and then went back and looked at the parallel life. And it's about a love story with an 80-year-old man looking back on his life. But it's also you realizing you would have been in love with the boy before you met him, because you're in those boxes and you're discovering. It almost it's making me cry here. You met your husband as a boy and realized, yeah, I think I would have loved him then too.
You're so right. I mean, I used to always say to him, would I have fallen in love with you if I'd known you? He was 12 years older than me. And what were you like then? And he would never answer me. He'd say, how would I tell you what I was like? I was too busy being me to be able to tell you what I was. But then I found these 50 letters that he had written to his best friend from Tufts, George. And George had given them back to us before he died. And they're wonderful letters. And so I really saw what this young man was like. I mean, I saw some of the arrogance that he had when he was at Harvard. And he was talking, but he was funny always. He was just funny. Funny makes a huge difference. There'd be times when I'd get mad at him, and then he would make me laugh at night. I'd be so mad I couldn't stay mad, you know. But these letters, like for example, in his first year at Harvard Law School, he writes about the enormous pressure he's under. You know, that they know that depending on what grade they're going to get, they'll get the job, they'll get the girl, they'll get their life. Everything will depend on it. Nobody worries. They worry about anybody's who's not sleeping when they're sleeping. Somebody's up working and I'm not working. And he talks about the fact that the year before, only 7 people in the practice exams had to be hospitalized. And the dean is saying, maybe we'll beat that record this year. But then finally he sends a letter to George in the summer, and he writes this chatty letter, and then he says, but for the want of a stamp, I've just found out my grades. I'm number 1 in the class. Eureka! I can't believe it. And then what happens is that then I get mad at him later, because then he gets quite arrogant when he's finally the editor of the Law Review, and they're flying him all around the country to any law firm he wants to go to. Or I can go to Europe, or I can be a clerk. It's the burden of choice. And then just as I read the burden of choice, I see a picture in the boxes, and it's the Law Review. And there's 60 guys, and there's 2 women. One is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and one is this woman, Nancy Boxley. And then she couldn't even get an interview for a job, much less a job, right? So I started yelling at him. Of course, it wasn't his fault. But then what was interesting is then I decided, what's this other woman, Nancy Boxley? So I went to interview her. She lived in California, and she was still beautiful. She'd been a beauty queen, evidently, and she looked great at 85 or 86. So she told me her story, that she too was Jewish like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So she had that strike against her. She was a woman, but she had not yet gotten married, and Ruth had a child. So that was too much for her to get a job. She got a job at Simpson Thatcher, but when she finally got married and got pregnant, they let her go. And so they said to her, we're not embarrassed by this, and they made the stomach coming out, but our clients might be. She eventually gets her work job back, but then she goes back to her 30th reunion at Harvard, and she has a professor that she's gone to contracts class with, new professors, and she's a young woman. She's wearing a short skirt. She has boots on, and she's very pregnant. So progress had happened.
But you have touched on this. One of the great things about the book It's not just a memoir. It's not just a love story. It's not just a history. It's sort of a meta-narrative about how to write all those things, because you take us into the process. You get into the books, you tell the story, and then you go, oh, I need to meet these people, like this woman. So you take us into your research, and you bring these people alive. So there's almost like a Greek chorus within the book. It's a genre of its own. This book. You've written a book at this point in your career that is a reinvention of what you've done all your life. So that was inspiring to me as a writer to read this sort of meta narrative. Like, go girl! I mean, you're like being inventive here.
Thank you. You know, I mean, one of the things that my publisher, who is also the head of Simon and Schuster, he's also my editor, told me, read novels before you start this, because you're going to be the narrator, and you have a choice of wherever you want to go. You can only tell the people what you want them to know, and that's important. So I read Prince of Tides, I read Gone Girl, I read Beloved, and all these, and I could see how they moved from one time span to another. So I had to keep the dates of the 60s going, because the 60s were going to go through chronologically. But you're right, I was going to be in 2014 or 2016 interviewing these other people, and I had to float. It was really hard. I always thought of structure was something I was very good at, but this got really scary, because people could get lost going, where are you going, back and forth in time? But somehow I think it came together.
It did. Another quote that I found thinking about you in baseball and writing, there's a Don DeLillo in Underworld. He opens that amazing book with Bobby Thompson hitting that home run, which made me think of you. And
Worst day of my young childhood. Many of you don't know, Bobby Thompson was a New York Giant player, and the Dodgers were in the playoffs, and we were way ahead, and he came up to bat, and he hit a home run. And I was so sad that I couldn't leave my house for days. And there was a store on the corner. They were all Giant fans, a butcher shop. And I used to always go in there, and the Dodgers were doing so well all summer. I was so happy to go in there, and now we'd lost. And so I wouldn't go back to the butcher shop. And finally, they sent me flowers, the first flowers I'd ever gotten. And they used to call me Rag Mop, because my hair was always messy. And they said, "Dear Rag Mop, please come back. We miss you." So you brought up the memory of Bobby. He brings up Bobby Thompson.
But DeLillo also writes in Mao something that reminded me of this book. He said, every sentence has a truth waiting at the end of it, and the writer learns how to know it when he finally gets there. On one level, this truth is the swing of the sentence, the beat and poise. But down deeper, it's the integrity of the writer as he matches with the language. I've always seen myself in sentences. I began to recognize myself word by word as I worked through a sentence. The language of my books has shaped me as a man. There's a moral force in a sentence when it comes out right. It speaks the writer's will to live. And I thought of you when I read this, and this book that you've just written, and writing it with Dick, and his writing as a speechwriter was all about getting to the end of the sentence, the integrity of the sentence, and keeping it when the man he was writing the speech for, especially Kennedy, would always go crisper, shorter.
No, it's interesting. I don't think of myself as somebody described by what you just said. I think Dick was that. Dick was a person who every sentence was crafted, and there was a poetry in his writing. I think my skill is a storyteller. It's a different kind of thing. I feel proud of being able to tell a story from beginning to middle, and to know when to put it in where. Structure, as I said. But he had and maybe, it's interesting, if you're able to feel that some of these sentences had their own integrity, it may be the influence of working with him on this, because that was his skill, which was much greater than mine in that sense.
Right. The melding of the two of you. I love the book. I mean, it's...
Oh, this is so happy to hear him say this. Because his stuff is amazing. So this is great to have a fellow writer say.
But let's talk about Kennedy and LBJ, because one of my favorite photos of you is when LBJ's bending down and you're whispering in his ear. Not only just the dynamic of it, but you're wearing leather fringe in the White House. And I thought, I want to know that woman. She's wearing leather fringe in the White House to work.
It's so embarrassing when I look at these pictures. I'm thinking, what am I thinking? Except it is the 1960s.
It's 60s, yeah.
But these dresses were short, and there was this fringe dress. Yeah, no, it was. Anyway, he was a great character. I mean, one of the things that has made me feel really happy about writing the book is that he did influence my life enormously. I mean, had I not worked for Lyndon Johnson, I would not have probably met Dick in the same way as I would. It was his having worked for LBJ before, me having worked for him later, that drew us together in a certain sense. And I would never have been a presidential historian were it not for Lyndon Johnson. I mean, just the idea that he was willing, after I had won this White House fellowship, we had a dance in the White House. He did dance with me. And then he found out a couple days later that I'd written an article that comes out in the New Republic, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power in 1968. And he somehow said, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. And then did get really close to him, went to the ranch and helped him on his memoirs. Mostly I just listened to him talk. He never, ever stopped talking. He talked when you were swimming in the pool. There were floating rafts with floating notepads in case he said something important. You know, he talked as you're waiting for the movie theater. And I guess he chose me to talk to because I listened to him. I think he chose me because he thought I was a young historian, perhaps. But I also worried that he chose me because I was a woman. And so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. And everything was fine until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous. He took me to the lake, nearby Lake LBJ, and he wine, cheese, all red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I've ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was either the worst line in history as a come on line, or and then I looked at her. I mean, she didn't look, but she wanted to be a writer. He thought of her as somebody who could have been a really good writer, and he loved her, and it was complicated, his relationship with her, but he did become my friend. And what I started saying is one of the things that mattered a lot to me was that both the daughters who are still alive, Lucy and Linda, read the book, and they really cared about it, and they felt it captured him. And that's what really matters to you.
Yeah, and you're very honest about him, because he comes off as someone who's almost bipolar. I mean, his mood swings were just so hard to, you really had to navigate the moods. He was up, he was down. You called them galloping depressions. Lady Bird said the Valley of the Black Pig, or after the Yeats poem. He was a very moody person.
No, and Lady Bird was stabilizing to him. He couldn't have gone through life without her. In fact, it was so important to me to have her as my friend when I was down at the ranch, because there would be times when some newspaper artist would say, why is this young girl going down to the ranch again, as if there was something going on with us. And she would just come up to me and said, we're not going to listen to them. I know how important you are, what a companion you are to him. And then in the last months, actually, before he left the presidency, so it would have been the fall of '68, we had this continuing running argument, because he'd asked me to help work on the memoirs, which I really wanted to do. But he said I had to come down and live there full time. I could be in Austin during the week, but I'd be in the ranch on the weekend. And it was all or nothing. I said, I'd love to come, but I want to go back and start teaching at Harvard. And I'll come on weekends. I'll come in the summers. It'll be great, part-time. And he said, nope, all or nothing. Until finally, and so then he got mad at me. Dick and I used to talk a lot, because when he got mad at Dick, he would be really rough. I mean, he could be mean. He would say things about him. I mean, one time when somebody knew that Dick had worked on a speech for him, and he got mad that Dick was getting credit for the speech. So somebody came in, Hugh Sidey, a reporter, said he knew that Dick had worked on the speech. He said, no, he didn't have a word to do on that speech. He'd already told Dick, this was the Great Society speech. He'd already told Dick that it was great, and he was so happy about it. But now he just simply said, I don't even know quite who he is. There's a Dick Goodman, not a Dick Goodwin, who's in miscellaneous. And that all became public. So that was really hard. He never did something like that to me. What he did to me was to just ice me out. Like when he was mad for me not being willing to go down there, he'd come in a room pretending I was no longer there. And he would talk to everybody else. He wouldn't look at me. Finally, Lady Bird came up to me and she said, don't worry, I know what this is all about. We'll get this right. So the last day of his presidency, he was leaving the next day, and there was a call for me to go into the White House. And I came in, and they were already dismantling the whole White House to get ready for the Nixon people, except the White House, the Oval Office. They leave it till the last thing to do. And I walked in, and he said, "All right, part-time." So she had somehow made that happen. And then I was able to...
Didn't he call you Harvard?
Yeah, he would call me Harvard. No, in fact, what he said is, it was so moving that he said, "Now I know you're going to go back to Harvard. Don't let them poison your feelings about me. I know what those Harvards are going to say about me." And then he said, then I left again, and then he said, "Come back." He said, "I know I'm not on the top of the world anymore. I appreciate that you're doing this." And it was just, but then she was amazing, as I said, that one of the, I'm going round and round in circles here, and we're not going chronologically, but what does it matter, because we're talking. She had a stroke somewhere in the in the early 2000s, and she couldn't speak anymore. And Team of Rivals came out, and she was listening to it on audio, and Lucy, the daughter, called me to say, "My mother wants you to know how much she loved the book." And I couldn't imagine what she was going to say, and Lucy said, "Just wait a minute." And then I waited, and I heard her clapping at the other end of the phone. Oh. And so it meant so much. And then I asked Lucy when I was writing it, I went back to her and I said, "Do I remember this right?" And she's very dramatic, Lucy. She said, "Oh, yes." She clapped with greater and greater intensity, and she wanted you to know that you were part of the family. And it was just, it meant so much.
Yeah. That was a wonderful story. In fact, I was going to end with that today, but, you just used it. So.
I suspect you'll find something else. So.
One of the things that Richard said when he got his diagnosis, and because he loves cigars. I mean, do you miss the smell of a cigar?
I love the smell, luckily. I've never smoked a cigarette. I've never smoked a cigar,
Right.
but the smell of it was... and he got goods. He had
Right.
Cubans that would...
Yeah.
I would have to bring them in, some of the places. He had them in my suitcase, so I'd be the one that would be in trouble.
Yeah, he said, "Look, there's three things about me. I'm left-handed, I have aggressive eyebrows, and I smoke cigars. That's me." So what are the three things about you that would sum you up if you were driving in a car and wanted to shut someone up?
I mean, I guess I would say I'm optimistic, and I've kept that temperament my whole life. Somehow my father had it, even though he was orphaned when he was a child and had a lot of difficulty in his life. I would say that I like being with people, that I need being with people, and that I love listening to their stories. And I do talk a lot. My sister said that I talked before I walked. I was somehow in the crib, still not able to walk, and I was talking already. I love talking.
And you love writing, thank God. Dick was also really friendly with Jackie Kennedy. They had a really special friendship, and one of the things that he helped her do was to plan that big party with all the Nobel Prize winners, which has always fascinated me. That party, and just the way they looked, because they'd been in Palm Beach and they came back with like their suntans and they were like movie stars. Have you been to the White House often, to those kind of parties? Did you?
No, there was something, I think there was something about that party, because Dick had sent a memo to Jackie, who he'd worked with on getting the Egyptian monuments saved after the Aswan Dam was going to flood over a lot of Egyptian monuments, and they needed to have money in order to move these great temples. And he and Jackie worked on it together. They got them moved, and then they got to choose a temple that they could choose from a scrapbook to bring to the United States in reward, and they chose the Temple of Dendur at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so then he came up and he said, "Well, how about a big dinner for the Nobel Prize winners?" Mainly, they were hoping that it would make young people know that you could be a celebrity, not as a movie star necessarily, but as a scientist. And then they added on to it Pulitzer Prize winners and writers as well. And it was just one of those magical nights that Jackie never forgot either. And she sent Dick a picture. So what happened is, because it was his idea, he got to escort her to the party. And you just look at his face. I mean, this huge grin on his face, like he's won the lottery somehow. She's so beautiful. And they're walking their violins on either side. And she sent him a picture of it, which we had on our wall all those years. And then she wrote and inscribed under it from a Keats poem, "Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music, do I dare?" I forget the rest of it. This is what I can't do. You probably know it. But anyway, and so she really did become a good friend. But we found a letter that she had written to him in 1966 from Hawaii, where she had gone to try and find the place that she would live. She didn't think she'd ever be able to go back to New York or Washington. So she was trying out places. She went to Brazil that year and Argentina and now Hawaii. And she knew all the writers that had found solace there. She talked about maybe Eastern philosophy would be better than Western, where they just give up and they just go day by day. And then she said to him, but you'd understand this, don't tell this to anyone else because you're a troubled soul as I am. And then I realized they really had become good friends. And I'd met her a couple times. I remember being at Caroline's wedding, and John Jr. was still then alive, and he gave the toast about how close Caroline and he had been, and how he welcomed the brother-in-law, Ed Schlossberg, they become such good friends that now there were three of them. And it was just so touching to know that. And I remember I went up to Jackie and I said, I just love that to happen to my boys, that they'd be close like that. And she looked at me straight in the face. Often she looked to you on the side, because maybe her face looked better on the side. She was so beautiful either way, it seemed to me. But she looked me straight in the face. She said, it's the best thing I've ever done, to have those kids be close. So that was fun for me. I learned much more about Jackie, I think, through this than I had known before.
They even had lunch at P.J. Clark's toward the end when she was diagnosed with cancer, and she asked him to come up to New York to confide in him, and she was dead in 4 months, I think.
The cancer, that was very aggressive. They thought they were going to get it, but they didn't.
Yeah. Have you ever read the Diana Trilling essay about that party?
Oh yeah, it's a great essay.
Oh my God!
Oh, no,
read that essay. It's dishy.
No, because what's happening is each Nobel Prize winner is seeing another one, and they're in their equal dimensions, but they're all famous. Right. And then they drank so much at the party.
So much.
And smoked cigars and smoked cigarettes. And I said to Dick, "What do you remember about the party?" To be honest, I can hardly remember it, because by the time the night ended, they went to Arthur Schlesinger's and drank some more.
Right. Yeah. But she and Lionel were invited to sort of the inner sanctum, and there's a lot of Jackie in it. Like, they have a discussion about D.H. Lawrence. She goes and gets a D.H. Lawrence in the next room, and she loves the rainbow, and he loves women in love, and Jackie's sort of dishy about LBJ.
Oh, it so pissed me off the way they'd be dishy about LBJ.
I know.
No, in Dick's diary, Dick kept a diary, and after JFK died, he and Bobby are having these conversations, and Bobby will say, what are we going to do about LBJ? He doesn't know anything about people who are hungry. Of course he knew about people who are hungry, much more than Bobby did.
Exactly.
And he
taught them.
Yeah. One of the things that happened in writing in going through the boxes was that I was the LBJ girl, and he was so in love with the Kennedys. And he had been so angry with Johnson, because Johnson had brought him to the height of his power. I mean, nothing that mattered more than Dick working on the We Shall Overcome speech, which I'd love to talk about in a minute.
Yeah, the swimming pool.
Oh, let's do that first. Okay, we'll do that first. Okay, so
we must talk about the swimming pool.
Okay. No, this is my favorite. He knows me probably that this is one of my favorite stories. So what happens is, after JFK dies, we were never quite sure what it was that made him. We knew that he knew that Dick had been a speechwriter for JFK, but what made him ask for him to come to the White House? Until we listened to one of the tapes. LBJ kept these great tapes. Of course, you could press a button in his Oval Office and record the conversation, which no one knew he was recording. And this is one with Bill Moyers. And he's saying to Bill Moyers, we need a speechwriter here who can put sex into my speeches, who can put rhythm into my speeches, who can write great Churchillian phrases. Who could that be? And Moyers said, the only one I know is Dick Goodwin, because Moyers and he had worked together at the Peace Corps, but he's not one of us. And what that meant, there was a fault line between the Kennedys and the Johnsons. So anyway, he says, well, let's try him out. And he tries him out on a message to Congress on poverty, and he does it good. And he finally brings him over, and he becomes his main speechwriter. But a month later or so, Moyers comes and says to Dick, the president wants to speak to us about a Johnson program. Now he's getting the Kennedy tax cut bill through. The civil rights bill that was Kennedy's is on its way to passage. He wants a Johnson agenda, and he wants to talk to us about it. So Dick says, are we meeting in the Oval Office? He said, no, we're going to the swimming pool. So they go to the swimming pool. Johnson is in the pool with nothing on, swimming up and down, side-stroking. Dick said he looked like a whale going up and down the pool. And the two of them are standing there in their suits and ties. And Johnson said, well, what's the matter with you guys? Come right in. So they have no choice but to stark naked as well. So they undress. Now you have three naked guys swimming around the pool. So finally they lean on the edge of the pool, and Johnson starts talking about what he wants as his agenda, the Johnson agenda. And he had already known the first night he was president what he wanted: Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, civil rights, voting rights, immigration reform. It was all in his head. And he talks about that. They decide they're going to make a speech. It'll be at the University of Michigan on May 22nd, and he's going to outline this new agenda, but it has no name. So they have to figure out, what are we going to call it? So they have various people want a better deal rather than a new deal, a good society, a glorious society. Finally, Dick writes a few speeches where he puts in the word Great Society, and that's what it becomes. So the Great Society was born in a pool with 3 naked guys swimming around.
I love that. It's such a Provincetown story. It's very touching. I mean, we've talked a lot about politics, but it is a book about your love of your husband, and at the end, the talisman chapter, it's very moving and sad, but also hopeful in a strange way, because we know you have finished the book, so there's hope there. I was very moved by what, like, Dick at Thanksgiving and the things that he would recite, by memory. And at the end of his life, he still, I'm not gonna cry, he still found the right words. He reached out to you and held your hand and said, "You're a wonder."
Imagine the last things he said to me before he died, or "You are a wonder." I mean, It's incomprehensible to come up with that in his head.
But you are, so thank you. And we would like to echo Lady Bird Johnson clapping for you right now. So thank you.
Wow. Do we get questions from them?
That's up to you.
Oh, are we okay on doing questions from people?
Yeah.
Of course. You call on them.
Me?
Yes.
That one?
You mentioned a couple of novels. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit more, expound on it, the relationship between sort of literature and fiction in your life as a historian, and how it nurtures you or influences you. You touched on it. I'd love to hear more about that. Some of the favorites that you go to.
Yeah, there are certain times I'll just go back to a novel that I've really loved, to just watch the way the fiction writer is able to control the narrative, as I said. I think that's what's really important. And when you're writing history, there are times when you wish you were a novelist, because then you could say what's in people's heads. You only can write what they said in a memoir or somebody said about them. I had this conversation with Steven Spielberg when he was making the movie Lincoln, based in part on Team of Rivals. And he was saying the great thing about being a filmmaker is you can put in the dialogue that is possible, but we don't know that it was necessarily said. I can't say that, and the fiction writer can. So I would talk to my people. I mean, there were times I remember when my younger sons, Michael and Joey, were little, and they heard me in the room when I was writing No Ordinary Time, and I was talking to Eleanor and Franklin, and I said to Eleanor, "Just forget that he had an affair so many years ago. He loves you. You're his partner." And then I'd say to Franklin, "Just know that you have to be kinder to her. She's everything you need her to be." And the kids are coming in, "What is going on in there?" That was the great thing about doing this with Dick. I could really talk to him. I didn't have to. They never answered me when I talked to Lincoln or I talked to Teddy Roosevelt. But now Dick could, but he could also argue with me on the other side of the room and tell me, "No, you haven't gotten this right." But I think it is that line that you, as a nonfiction writer, that you can get everything you possibly know, and you really know what they might have been saying or what they were thinking, but you can't cross that line. And fiction allows you to cross that line and to get as close to it as you can in nonfiction. So with enough detail that the person might feel you're really in the room with them. I mean, I call them my guys, those 4 guys, Lincoln and Teddy and Franklin and LBJ, not being disrespectful, but just because I felt like I had lived with them for so long that I could do that. When they were relaxing, I'm with them. When Lincoln went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War, and I was so glad to see him relaxing. When Teddy would have a boxing match or a wrestling match at the end of the day, a hard day, and he somehow was able to finally replenish his energies. Or best of all, when FDR would have his cocktail parties, there was nothing I wished more than to be at one of those cocktail parties with him, where the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about books and gossip and fiction, anything else other than the war. And in fact, I became obsessed with the people who would go to the cocktail party were the people he was closest to in the White House. And after a while, he wanted them to be ready for the cocktail party, that he had them live in the White House. So they're right on the second floor with him. Missy LeHand, his secretary, is right there. Lorena Hickok, Eleanor's friend, is there. Princess Martha comes on the weekends. Churchill is there. And I mentioned this on a radio program in Washington, that I wished I could see those rooms again once more. I'd been up there with LBJ, but I hadn't ever asked then, where did Franklin live? I wasn't thinking about them. And so I mentioned it. Hillary Clinton was at the White House then. She invited me to a sleepover in the White House. So we could then wander the corridor together and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So she followed up with a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2, we went through every room up there. And I figured out that Chelsea Clinton was sleeping where Harry Hopkins, his foreign policy advisor, had been. The Clintons were sleeping where FDR went. She had given us Winston Churchill's bedroom. There was no way I could sleep. He was in the corner drinking his brandy. So I was talking to him all night long. So anyway, this is what happens. You do feel like you're involved with them, and you can only go so far, except in your imagination. I knew what Churchill was talking to me about that night.
Hi. Thanks. I have kind of a variation on the question that I'd asked you earlier, which is, what do you think is the moral integrity of this country, given that nearly the majority of the country is supporting a man who is pure depravity? So one part is, do you think the moral spine of this country has declined? And the second part is, why do you remain optimistic that this country will persevere and rise again? Because the examples you gave in the past of struggles that this country had faced were ones where the collective sentiment of the country was to rise above, say, the evil of Hitler or whatever adversity. But now the country is really divided between what seems to me to be one set of morals and principles and another.
You know, I think that if people come out and vote, it's not divided as much as it seems. I think that there's a much larger majority of the people who understand the need for voting rights, understand the need for a woman to have a right to choose, understand the need for gun safety. Every one of those polls tell us that that's where the country is. And the electoral college system is a problem. But if more people come out, the young people, I think, are going to help us. I really do. There's a guy at Harvard, John Della Volpe, who does these young people's polls. They made the difference in 2018. They made the difference in 2020 and in 2022. They were tuned out a month or two ago. They are coming back in again. And I think if they come out in the numbers that they will, I think it could even be something better than a close election. I really do. I think it could possibly move in that direction.
Oh, in the back.
Related to the first question a little bit. Thank you. Are there movies that you watch where you, as a historian, and think, wow, they really got this right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. I mean, I love movies. And I think, one of the things that was interesting about the Lincoln movie was that people would say to me, but how did you feel about the fact that it was only a small piece of the plot of my book, the 13th Amendment? That was it. All that I cared about was, did he get Lincoln right? Did he get his humor in there, which he did? Did he get his statesmanship? Did he get his political skill? As long as the character is right, I think it's fine for them to be able to take leeway in terms of what the storyline is going to be, and I think that was a wonderful movie, and I think Oppenheimer was an incredible movie, and it was so happy that history now, when there's a movie that can make so much money as a history movie. I mean, there were structural problems in it, I thought, but that doesn't matter. It worked, and you felt transported back to that time. I love watching historical documentaries. I think, we worry about history not being taught as much in high schools now, that people are not taking history as a major, that there are fewer colleges doing it. It really is heartbreaking to me, because it's everything we should care about. It's people who lived before us. We learn from our parents, we learn from our grandparents, we learn from history. We have to learn from the struggles and the triumphs.
Oppenheimer was at the Nobel Prize party.
Yes, he was. That's right. That's right.
Everything connects. Would you go see?
Everything connects.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. we talked about that.
We know something.
Right. Would you go see Oh Mary on Broadway?
Oh, I'd love to. I definitely want to. I mean, I know it's really fun. If it's funny, then I mean, I know it. And she was a wild character herself. So I definitely want to see it. And I want to see Suffs. I haven't seen
I
that.
saw that. It's amazing. Yeah. Wow. Have you ever seen the documentary on PBS about the suffragettes? I think it's 3 parts. It's fast. It's
fantastic.
Fast.
It's
Isn't it
fantastic.
amazing? It's amazing. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe I can say this without the.
You have a good voice. I can hear it.
And I really want to talk about the art of the speechwriter in a sense. It's sort of personal to me, but if you think about the ability of public speaking and the ability to get it right, I want to go back to Lincoln, because did he have help in writing his speeches, or did he do it all himself?
The question, if you couldn't hear it, was did Lincoln have help in writing his speeches, or did he do it all himself? He mostly did it all himself. I mean, John Hay was able to write letters to certain people, and there's some thought that maybe one of those famous Bixby letters that he wrote was from John Hay. But no one else could have done what Lincoln did. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, what Dick would say about speechwriting is that it depends on the moment. It's not just what you say. If you were going to be Patrick Henry and say, give me liberty or give me death at a Chamber of Commerce meeting in a prosperous time, it wouldn't go anywhere. It happened to be at the early days of the Revolution. And for Dick, too, I mean, the crowning speech that he worked on was the We Shall Overcome speech for Lyndon Johnson after the Selma demonstrations. And he had only that day to write that speech, but somehow the pressure of it, I couldn't have possibly done that. I kept saying to him, history's more patient. Luckily I have more time. But he was able, like every writer, and I'm sure you know this as well, so he was told the morning of the speech was going to be given to a joint session of Congress on Monday night. And he was told by Lyndon Johnson that morning that he had to get it done by that night. And he just said the only thing he needed was serenity. Nobody could bother him. So he was in his office, and he spent the whole probably first hours coming up with the first line. That's so hard for any writer, for anybody. And he comes up with an incredible line. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. And then every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It is not even a moral problem. It is simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. It is an American problem, and we're met here tonight as fellow Republicans and Democrats to solve that problem. And then he says, but even if we solve that problem, the century of bigotry is still there, and we will have to go a long way. But if we work together, and then he paused, and in the middle of that afternoon, while Dick was working on that speech, he took a break to smoke a cigar, and he went outside, and he heard people in the distance singing, We Shall Overcome. So he comes and puts that line for Lyndon Johnson, who paused, and he said, We shall overcome, which means you're taking the anthem of the civil rights movement that gave courage to the freedom fighters, and you're bringing it to the highest councils of power. And that's when change happens, when the outside movement meets. It's what happened with the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, all of those movements. And that was just a moment. The audience went crazy. And Dick was standing at the back of the House of Representatives that night. And he said, God, how I loved Lyndon Johnson that moment, how I could not have imagined that I'd be marching against him on the war. And what happened was that the grievance he had for so long, I've now veered away from that, the grievance he felt for so long had really poisoned him. Lincoln used to say, the worst emotions are jealousy, anger, or grievances held from the past. They'll poison you. And I always felt so sad about it. It was what made him sad, I think, in those years. And when we went through the boxes again in 64 and 65, and he remembered the Great Society, he remembered that moment of the We Shall Overcome speech, and he realized that the Great Society wasn't destroyed. It was still around us. So much of it is still here. That he came up to bed one night and he said, oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old boy again. But it meant that he had let those grievances go. And everybody who knew him knew that in those last years, even that last year of cancer, he was more serene than he'd been for a long period of time. So somehow, I'm really unwinding, probably because you've got me to think about all this. But anyway, that speech mattered enormously. And I think he felt proud. He felt that he had made a difference when he realized that, and because that's considered one of the great speeches, not because of the words in it alone, but because it touched that moment. Most importantly, 4 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed. I mean, that's what's the measure of a speech. What action does it produce?
One more question.
Thank you. If there was one historical mystery you could solve, what would it be?
Wow. Wow. You know, it's interesting. I was just down in Texas a month or so ago and went to Dealey Plaza and went up to the book depository. And for some reason, that's what you would imagine I would say. But I don't know that it matters anymore, you know, who it was that killed John Kennedy. I mean, Dick was with Bobby one night, and Bobby said he never, ever hardly talked about it. But he said if it was anybody, he thought it was not the Cubans, not the Russians, but the mafia. And this, it's probably one of the biggest mysteries of my time. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd love to solve the mystery of how Abraham Lincoln came to be. It's still a miracle to me that given the hardships of the world that he had to grow up in, and it's a tribute to literature in a way. The only way he could imagine himself not being trapped in the poverty of his childhood with a father who didn't respect that he liked to read books, who took his books away from him because he wasn't working on the field well enough. And then he somehow was able to scour the countryside and get books. I don't know how he did it. And there's something about his character that when I started working on the book on Lincoln, David Donald, who was the great Lincoln scholar, said, "You will never regret this. You will feel like you're a better person at the end." And because somehow there was something about his character. And the mystery of how he became who he is, I'd love to know more about that. You know, I think maybe to end with the thing that mattered so much to me in ending the Lincoln book was that Tolstoy told a story that I just was the way I could end it rather than Lincoln dying. And the story had to do with the fact it showed how Lincoln's name had reached this remote corner of Russia. Tolstoy said at the turn of the 20th century, he was talking to a reporter from New York, and he said that he had just come back from a remote area of the Caucasus where there were a group of wild barbarians. They'd never left that part of Russia. They were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst, they asked him to tell stories of the great men of history. So I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great and Julius Caesar, and they loved it. But before I finished, the chief stood up and he said, "But wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We'd like to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he'd be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln." Tolstoy was stunned to know that Lincoln's name had reached this corner. So he told them everything he knew about Lincoln. And then the reporter said to him, "Okay, what made Lincoln so great? The mystery that I'd like to know." And Tolstoy said, "Well, he wasn't as great a general as Napoleon, not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great. His greatness consisted in his character and the moral fiber of his being." So to go back to Ansel's question, we have to trust in character. That's what we hope in our children. We hope to bring them up that way, to accept loss, to acknowledge errors, to not complain about things, to go forward and have hope for the future. And that's what we've got to trust. We've got enough people of character in this country that'll carry us through this.
Thank you.